Have you found that it's really hard to start getting tedious tasks done around the house, except for when you're running late for an appointment? Or have a really hard time getting started on a new project because you're not sure where to begin? And instead, you spend all day sorting through emails, cleaning out your closet, and a bunch of other random things just to avoid that feeling of not knowing where to begin? Well, I'm guessing this probably resonates with some of you. It's certainly something that I have struggled with for sure. But don't worry, if this does sound familiar, you're not broken, and the answer is not working harder. It's really about understanding what's actually happening in our brain and our nervous system, and then finding something that actually works for us. So sometimes I actually have to laugh at myself because I have found some pretty silly, creative ways to trick myself into getting things done at times. But honestly, a little humor and creativity can go a long way. So I do hope you stick around because today we're going to talk about executive functioning, emotional regulation, and how deeply they are connected to ADHD and what to do when we're feeling stuck. Hi, and welcome to Unmasked and Becoming. My name is Eliza. I'm a trauma informed certified ADHD life coach, and I was diagnosed with ADHD later in life. My passion is working at the intersection of evidence informed coaching and intuitive practice because I really believe that when we're able to connect with that deeper inner knowing within ourselves and integrate it with evidence based research, we can actually really become empowered advocates for our own healing and the healing of our planet. So, today we're going to talk about executive functioning. And basically, what it is, it's a set of mental processes that need to work together in order for us to turn our intention into action. So, to really understand how that challenge can can come up for people with ADHD, I like to use an analogy of an orchestra. So, in an orchestra, we have different sections of music, right? Our instruments. There's the woodwinds and the brass and percussion instruments and that sort of thing. And similarly, in executive function, um, there are mental processes that need to get come together, such as like working memory, which is basically holding more than one thing in our heads at a time so that we can then apply that to new information and create new ideas and strategies and that kind of thing. Being able to control our impulses, our ability to shift our attention from one thing to another or plan ahead, the ability to manage time, right? So not losing track of time, being late to things, the ability to regulate our emotions as well. So when all of those things are working together, we can flow, we can get things done. But like a symphony, those music sections of instruments, they don't organize themselves. They need a conductor. And that conductor is basically analogous to our prefrontal cortex, which is up in the front of our brains. And that's what coordinates everything together so that we can get things done. So for people with ADHD, it's almost like there's a communication barrier between the conductor and the orchestra. And there is a neurological reason for that challenge or that communication breakdown. And, of course, our brains are complicated. So I'm just going to kind of give you the nutshell version here. But research does show that there are structural differences in our brains, along with differences in our neurochemicals and how they're metabolized. So neurochemicals like dopamine and norepinephrine aren't as accessible to send messages in our brains that are required for motivation, attention, and follow through in the same way they are for neurotypical people. So this makes it much harder for our prefrontal cortex to communicate and coordinate with the other parts of our brain that we really need to get things done. So that's why I say, we're not lazy or incapable. It's not that we're not dedicated enough. It really is literally that our brains are communicating differently. So, in a neurotypical brain, the motivational system responds reasonably well to things like deadlines or future rewards and the importance of getting something done because you've agreed to do it. But in the ADHD brain, that system tends to be less responsive to those internal cues. So, instead, Dr. William Dodson, who's written extensively on executive function, says that people with ADHD have an interest task-driven nervous system, which means motivation isn't primarily coming from the importance of getting something done just because it's due or because we, signed up or agreed to do something. Is really driven by our genuine interest, that feeling of urgency or novelty or having a passion for something. So when something is genuinely engaging, our ADHD brain can be remarkably focused. And that's where, sometimes you'll hear people call ADHD a superpower. And it's often related to that ability to go into hyperfocus when we're really interested in something. And all of a sudden, our focus is so intense that we can actually get a lot done in a short period of time. So, but when on the opposite end of that, if it's not something that feels super interesting and is more tedious, repetitive, or maybe unclear, getting started on something can feel really difficult. So again, it's not laziness, it's a neurochemical, signal that is not happening that we need to get started. And that's just not engaging. So it's why many of us really need to find creative ways to engage our motivation. And finding interesting angles in a boring task, pairing something hard with something we enjoy, creating urgency when there isn't any urgency, working with a friend or in a coffee shop, right? So I really encourage you to consider what interests you and how you might be able to apply that to finding creative ways to get unstuck as we're going along in today's episode. So another really important piece, and it's something that I don't feel like gets nearly enough attention, and that is emotional regulation in ADHD, because it's could be one of the most disruptive parts in the daily life of someone with ADHD, and it's also one of the most misunderstood. So emotional regulation is actually part of our executive function. So, knowing that emotional regulation is managed by the same system of our other executive functioning skills can help us see that that challenge we're experiencing isn't really an issue of being overly emotional. It's more a neurological difference. And I pulled a tarot card specifically for this. I pulled the Eight of Swords with the intention of talking about this particular kind of struggle that we can have. So if you're not familiar with the Rider-Waite, that's this deck here. This comes from that deck. This is this from the suit of the sword. So the swords represents the element of air, and air is the mind. It's the communication and thoughts and that kind of thing. And this is the eight. So the eight can symbolize, the number eight is really kind of a power number. It's like, movement and personal power. But in this particular, with the swords in this suit, it's kind of that opposition of feeling stuck or overwhelmed, or maybe having power struggles, mental loops, thought loops that go around and around, and that feeling of being stuck. So I'm going to just kind of invite you to check out this character here and just imagining that this is somebody maybe who has ADHD, okay? And they are confronted by maybe a new project or something that's coming up that they need to get done that maybe they don't feel super jazzed about or super interested in. And they're feeling stuck as to where to get started. So if you can see, this person here in this image is blindfolded here, kind of loosely blindfolded, and they're kind of bound here, and we've got these swords that are surrounding them. And so for any of those of you who've seen my previous videos, and you'll know that I do really enjoy using symbolism, and mostly because it does kind of get us out of our head and more into our bodies and into our sense of deeper intuition. So just kind of using this as a metaphor for this experience, it kind of can give us a feeling of what happens for us. So this blindfold, not being able to see what's going on around them, is kind of representing that feeling, that not being able to see, right? Obviously, but the challenge that we have between the communication between our executive functioning and our prefrontal cortex. Like, if we've got a lot of mental load going on because we have now felt a little overwhelmed by this big task that we don't know how to get started, that can sort of start impacting even more our ability to communicate with the parts of our brain that we do need in order to get started. And so, what commonly happens for people when they experience that, there's a sense of mounting emotional overwhelm as well, because right, our emotional regulation, our ability to emotionally regulate is connected to our executive function. So that feeling of increased emotional overwhelm can often lead us to wanting to avoid because it's so uncomfortable, right? And so we'll go and do something that distracts us, right? Whether it's scrolling social media or, whatever it is. But we can kind of start finding ourselves and feeling like, we're kind of get stuck in something else that's because maybe the negative thoughts start coming. Just because we're distracting ourselves with something else doesn't mean that we're just not in the background still feeling that emotional overwhelm and probably some negative thoughts. And the swords, like I mentioned, they represent the suit of air, which is the mental realm and the mental world. So we've got all these swords here kind of almost surrounding this person. So these thoughts of, gosh, I just can't do this. Why can't I just get this thing done? But I just don't feel like I can. What if I mess up? What if sometimes it's even, what if I do finally get the energy to pull this off? And then everyone's going to expect even more from me. What if I can't keep that up? People are going to see through me. They're going to see that I'm a fraud. All these thoughts that we can get lost in. And of course, that kind of can make the emotional overwhelm feel more intense as well. And it really feeds each other in this very painful way oftentimes. So basically, the spiral, it sort of generally overwhelms our nervous system. And for some people, that can really lead to that shutdown, that kind of feeling of just being trapped, paralysis. It can even turn into depression. So it can be really tough. And often what will happen, is if we've procrastinated long enough, that task becomes more urgent, right? That urgency that we actually do need to get started starts to come online, and our stress response comes online as well. And that is usually run by a neurochemical or a chemical in our body called cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone. So it can kick us into the gear that dopamine wasn't available in our brains to be able to do. So that jumpstart in the short run can get us over the hump and can get us to get something done. However, if we continue to rely on that as a way to get things done, and that cortisol is always having to be utilized for that, it can really drain our system over the time, and it can lead to burnout. And a lot of people with ADHD do suffer with burnout off and on in their lives because of that exact issue. So, the thing, though, is when we look at this particular card, right, and kind of take ourselves outside of ourselves, because that's part of using imagery, is that it's outside of ourselves. We can see something outside of ourselves that we can't really see when we're in our own experience. So when we slow down a little bit and we look at this more closely, we can see that this person is very loosely bound, that these swords really are not a cage. They have certainly a way to get in and out. And it's hard to see in this, but there is a path that actually is going back into this castle area here, it looks like. So there is, because this person's not able to see it, they don't recognize, they're lost in those thoughts. And they're not able to see the other options available to them. And so that's kind of where the beauty of this card comes in, because it can help us see that clearly and recognize that instead of being trapped by our emotions and limiting beliefs and those really challenging negative thoughts of like, why can't I do this? And I'm, all those beating up like things that we do to ourselves. We can actually turn it into this question of, well, if I ask myself instead, what would help me access that part of my brain or nervous system that actually can help me get through this situation? Right. So by recognizing why this happens to us, we can actually be able to ask ourselves different questions and handle the situation differently. Maybe not initially, because oftentimes our bodies go really quickly into that kind of shutdown mode sometimes. But when we have had enough experience and recognize and understand our brains work, we can transition how we're talking to ourselves, or plan strategies that we can then use when we know this might come up for ourselves, right? Plan things in advance to support us. And you know, it's also really important to know like what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for everyone else. So taking time ahead of time, knowing the kinds of things that do trigger us this way, and having time ahead of time to plan strategies and things that we can use when we're feeling like this can really help us to, instead of feeling trapped and just getting kind of in a darker, deeper spiral around it, we can find the path out. So, how do we create these strategies that work for us? Well, first, it's really important to know, like I said, what works for you is going to be different than other people. And, ADHD is complicated. We're all very different. So, finding a coach or someone who can help you sort through this stuff can be really helpful. And, with that said, it is useful to also understand what science has shown to be kind of general principles around certain strategies that might be more effective, or ways of looking at or finding strategies that are going to be more effective for the ADHD brain. So Dr. Russell Barkley and Dr. Thomas Brown are both well-known researchers on this topic and have found something called externalization, and that can be really helpful. And it's a very simple concept, but it can be applied in a lot of different ways. So because executive functioning challenges in ADHD, largely the struggle is in accessing the internal cues that we need to remind ourselves of, when something's due, the passing of time, to be able to generate our own sense of motivation when something's not particularly interesting to us. We need to find ways to externalize those cues out in our environment, so that instead of putting all the pressure and load of all of those executive functions on our internal brains and nervous systems, we can look to our environment to hold some of that for us and take that load off our executive function so that we can function better. So it's kind of like thinking about it like the scaffolding of the building, right? When we have scaffolding, we can use that to help us make repairs. It doesn't replace the building. It's just there to help and support us while it's necessary to get the work done. So some of the external kind of scaffolding tools that people do use, and again, they might not work for you, but it's kind of good to like think about these kind of basic concepts and then find ways that might work for you. I know for me, I really struggle with time blindness. I have the best intentions in the world that I'm, going to be 5 minutes when I say it's going to be 5 minutes. But honestly, it's amazing how when I get caught up in something, how I totally lose track of time. So having visible clocks in every room can be really helpful. For me, I really like time timers or Pomodoro timers because they're super simple. And I don't have one in front of me here, but basically they have different time, like segments, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, 20, and so forth. And you just turn it to whichever time block you want it to set for, and it will just immediately set for that time. And then the alarm will go off, so that if I get super caught up in, doing my hair or something before I have to get out the house, and then I realize, oh, I'm spending way too much time in here, jamming to music or whatever I end up doing, like alarms me. And it's honestly, it's like really helping me to start actually recognizing what time passage feels like a little bit better so that I am gauging it a little better on my own. And, obviously having that external reminder just helps me to move forward to the next step, which is great. And other things like, having physical calendars, because it's, out of sight, out of mind. That can be really, if it's not visible, you know, our minds often just treat it like it doesn't exist. So having a calendar on the wall that you can really see, I have a pretty large one in my kitchen, so I can really see what's coming on what day. Um, Basically, having things that are visible, like, you can, I mean, there's so many different things. It's like kind of over my brain's overwhelmed with all the thoughts. So I'm going to slow down for a second, but um, it, it is actually it's one of the areas where I think we can get really creative, and sometimes having a friend or somebody to talk these things through with can really help, because sometimes people have other, when we riff with other people about their ideas, it can give us ideas that, maybe we can tailor to ourselves. So that's really, that can be really helpful. I really appreciate people put comments. If you want to share any of the ideas and things that have worked for you, I think it would really be helpful to share so we can all kind of benefit from each other's ideas. What else? Let's see. Making tasks visible. So, if you have whiteboard space, it can be really helpful. Obviously, sticky notes, I'm kind of the sticky note queen. Open planners, again, you don't really want books can be hard unless you have your book open to that page every time during the day, which might work for you. And then like things like kind of routines and rituals. Now, for some people, routines can be really boring and hard, so that might not work for you. But for other people, creating, let's say, a music list. Or a playlist, I mean, that you can turn on and just kind of get you up and going in the morning, and you kind of know that that's your morning music to get things done. Or creating a special space where you do particular activities can engage, like can kind of actually just set the stage for you to jump into something, and it kind of helps your body awareness kind of takes over and it reduces the amount that you have to think about what you're going to do, because in this spot I always do X, Y, and Z. Or finding kind of places outside of your home that you find inspirational that can kind of give you that extra energy you need to get something done. Sometimes when I feel like, oh my God, I'm so tapped out writing this paper, I just need to get out of the house, but I bring my journal with me, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I just needed to get a different, viewpoint. I need to get out of the house. Sitting out here and getting some sunlight and some air can really like mix things up and help you kind of recharge, if you're not feeling very motivated to do something. And then like breaking routine into smaller steps that you can make visible. Like if there's something routine in your day that you just maybe just don't enjoy doing, but you have literally, I even have little icons of pictures of things that's like, first I do this and then I do that. And it just kind of, it sounds maybe silly, but it just takes that one little bit off my brain to have to process in my executive functioning, and helps me to just launch into something. So, just find what works for you. But research does show that our environment can definitely help boost our willpower if it's set up in a way that works for us. Body doubling, that's another really big one, especially for in the ADHD community. So you might already be aware of that. But body doubling is basically, if you don't know, the process of working in the presence of another person. So they don't actually have to help you. Their presence is just kind of that external regulation. So for people with ADHD, if we tend to have, understimulated or quiet environments, can be hard for us to kind of get going in. So having another person kind of provides enough external input to help our nervous system stay engaged and on task. So, studies show that clinical observation and consistently support this, that ADHD brains often regulate better with external rather than internal cues. So that social presence is one of the most natural forms of that. So just working with a friend or, in a coffee shop sometimes, if you don't have just somebody to hang out with and do work with, but just going somewhere where it's busy can sometimes help keep you engaged. And then external accountability structures. So having someone that you schedule a check-in with regularly that helps keep you accountable can be really helpful, or a coach can serve in that function as well. So just having someone else that kind of acts as that external motivation signal can be helpful when we struggle to create our own sense of motivation inside of ourselves. And then I want to talk about emotional regulation tools because externalizing things can actually help here too. So, because emotions in the ADHD brain often move faster than the thinking brain, we aren't always able to regulate from the inside. We often need to start with our body and the environment to help us get regulated. So, what if you're feeling like something happens and you're feeling emotional dysregulation coming on, you can just excuse yourself and go to the bathroom. Just splashing some cold water on your face can really help the nervous system shift into a different state. Just moving around can as well. So going for a walk can really help us get out of a stuck state. See, and naming our emotions. Now, this one might sound super simple, but it's surprisingly powerful. And research has found that putting our feelings into words externally, so either saying it out loud or writing it on a piece of paper, in a journal or something, it's a process called affect labeling, and it actually activates that prefrontal cortex and helps create distance from the emotional intensity. So when you say, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, or you write that out, you're not just describing your experience, you're actually engaging the part of the brain that is needed to help start regulating it. So this form of externalizing can help get perspective on what you're experiencing instead of feeling like your feelings are just happening to you. So, practicing this over time reduces cognitive load on your executive functioning because you're not trying to manage that emotion silently on the inside while also trying to get the thing done you're doing. And then tracking our patterns. This is also really simple but really helpful because if we keep a external record of what causes us to feel overwhelmed, of what makes our day harder, or what helps us and tends to help us get more energy, that kind of gives us a map as we kind of get to learn our own nervous systems and the way we are during the day. We can then prepare for those things. So and it helps us to, by knowing that ahead of time, it takes that processing that we normally would have to be doing in that moment out of the equation and reduces that load on our executive functioning. And also, I think it takes away some of that self-criticalness because we kind of know already. It's like, it's not this question of like, why can't I do this? It's more like, oh yeah, this is how I work. From 2 to 5, I am pretty much no good to anyone. It's like after lunchtime, I'm just kind of feeling sluggish, and there's just no way that's a good time for me to be doing any kind of like really boring, tedious task kind of work. So it's helpful to know those things ahead of time, and kind of keeping track of our day and our tendencies can be really helpful. And then self-compassion after hard moments. So I think this can be really hard for a lot of people. I think a lot of us do not practice self-compassion. And in fact, I think we almost can get really stuck in the negative kind of way of chastising ourselves when we're not doing a good job or not living up to something that we feel like we should be able to do. But self-compassion actually, it's actually more neurologically helpful than just emotionally soothing ourselves than we realize. So that feeling of shame that might come over us when we do kind of saying negative things to ourselves, what's wrong with me? Why did I let that happen again? It actually activates the threat response in our nervous system, that fight or flight that triggers us into feeling like we're not safe. And then it literally makes it harder for our executive function to regulate, because our system is, when we're trying to protect ourselves, the brain is not going to send any information towards trying to figure out, how to write a paper. Like that's not important compared to our safety. So actually feeling safe in our bodies and feeling comfortable is when our brain's going to be more optimal and be able to run on all the circuitry. And so, and this is research as well. Dr. Kirsten Neff's research on self-compassion shows that when we can be kind to ourselves and show self-compassion, we develop increased emotional resilience overall. And we actually ruminate on negative thoughts less. Those loops that go around and around, that actually happens less. So I'm not talking about, there's nothing wrong with affirmations and that kind of thing, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm actually talking about naming the thing that's going on and having compassion. So saying something like, that was really hard. My nervous system was really overwhelmed, but I got through it, and I can try again when I'm feeling better. This is not the end of the world. I can try again. Like, it's getting it out of yourself, those thoughts, writing that down or saying it out loud gets it out of our heads. And it also helps us to reflect on a much positive, narrative. It's not ignoring the situation, but it's not letting yourself off the hook. It's just supporting your brain to feel safer so that you can recover more quickly, and you'll feel less bad about yourself ultimately. And it's probably a no-brainer, but it really does work. And we can feel a little silly sometimes when we're saying these things out loud. So like I said, writing it out on paper can really be helpful. It really is interesting. It's like, until you try it, you don't know. So I really encourage you to try it if you're able to. And then, I get it. I for those of us who have carried shame around for a long time, I mean, it's not always easy to change these habits. It can be really difficult, and I absolutely understand that, because I experienced a lot of that, especially being diagnosed later. I think that not understanding what has been going on with me really made me blame myself for a lot of things unfairly, and built up a lot of feelings of shame. So it does. We have to be patient with ourselves. It's not something we can just change overnight. And we really do need to remember, though, that we've worked really hard in systems that were not designed for us, and we really do deserve support that meets us where we're at. So, I do encourage you to seek the support that you think will be most helpful. And certainly, if you're interested in getting coaching with me, I invite you to please, check out my website. It's at elizalifecoach.com. And you can book a free consultation with me, and we can start a conversation and just see if coaching might be a good fit for you. And I'll put that link in the description as well for you. But just remember, like, there isn't a one size fits all ADHD toolkit. And sometimes tools that have worked for us in the past stop working for us. And, that's kind of normal for people with ADHD brains, because we can habituate quickly to things that once felt novel or engaging, and now they kind of feel routine and boring. So it's not a failure on our part when that happens, really. It's just that we need to kind of renew and find and adjust for things like that, to find new ways that our brains will respond to, and do our best to stay curious, and try not to be self-critical if we can, because that's only going to make it harder. So I hope that this was helpful information to you. And if you did like this video, please, I invite you to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help me to get this content out to other people who need to hear it. So And also, if you would like to share, what maybe has landed for you today or strategies and things that have worked for you, I'd love to hear about them. Please feel free to put them in the comments. And it helps other people too when we share with each other about things that work in a community like this. It can really help each other. So I invite you to do that if you feel comfortable doing so. So that's it for today. And until next time, please be kind to yourself. Sending you lots of love.